Part of the stated mission of the director's series is watching a given filmmaker's output in chronological order, so as to better chart his or her artistic development. Of course, there are always exceptions to the rule, and Malick's experimental documentary Voyage of Time is one particularly apt exception. Sandwiched between the release of 2015's Knight of Cups and 2017's Song to Song, Voyage of Time bears such an undeniable association with the Tree of Life that one simply cannot fully explore either work without the context of the other. Indeed, the majority of Voyage of Time's footage was captured at the same time as the Tree of Life's corresponding creation sequences, suggesting that the two works continually informed one another throughout the course of production. Voyage of Time shares the Tree of Life's extensive slate of producing talent, boasting the oversight of Grant Hill, Brad Pitt, Bill Pohlad, and Dee Dee Gardner, as well as his regular producing partners Sarah Green and Nicholas Gonda. Though this team had been actively producing Voyage of Time for the preceding 12 years on a budget of $12 million, Malick's personal development efforts stretched back even further to his days developing Q, of which both works are a natural outgrowth. Malick has described his vision for Voyage of Time as, quote, one of his greatest dreams. And indeed, there were so many points throughout development, production, and release where said dream could have gone unrealized. Thankfully, not only does Voyage of Time exist, but it does so in no less than 3 different variants, each one endeavoring to expand on the Tree of Life's cosmic creation sequences with a celebrative foray into the evolution of life and the universe. Indeed, Voyage of Time plays very much like the Tree of Life, had the 1950s Waco and modern-day Dallas threads been excised completely. The general thrust of story is the same across all 3 versions, featuring stunning landscape and wildlife photography shot by famed nature cinematographer Paul Atkins, as well as evocative liquid physics and spinning dish effects by special effects supervisor Dan Glass, working under Douglas Trumbull. Without any narrative attachments to a central character, Voyage of Time becomes perhaps the purest expression of Malick's voice as a filmmaker, a towering chronicle spanning all of time and space in its exploration of cosmic creation and the evolution of life on Earth. Following the course of nearly all of his post-hiatus output, Voyage of Time spent an interminable amount of time in post-production, lagging behind the Tree of Life's release by 5 years, despite most of its photography occurring simultaneously. The positive critical reviews out of festivals like Venice and Toronto didn't quite align with the mixed reception by audiences. Another outcome that speaks to Malick's polarizing status within contemporary cinema. Distributor Broad Green Pictures, the now-defunct company who also brought Knight of Cups and Song to cinema screens, wisely programmed Voyage of Time at specialty Imax theaters and nature and science centers, rather than conventional multiplexes. This strategy admittedly would limit the film's box office potential, but it also reinforced a kind of academic pedigree usually accorded to nature documentaries. If we're being honest with ourselves, Voyage of Time was never going to be a blockbuster anyway. One could argue Broad Green's approach was sound, and its decision to embrace the rarefied air of exclusivity that a limited specialty release would provide. Regardless of reception, the film's release represents the fulfillment of one of Malick's longtime dreams as a filmmaker, the culmination of decades of thought and physical effort, molded in the shape of a once-in-a-lifetime work of cinematic art. The Tree of Life and Voyage of Time represent Malick's attainment of something like perfection within his unique visual style, both featuring narratives that effortlessly lend themselves to a series of fleeting vignettes and experimental, symbolic imagery. Indeed, the aesthetic on display is about as close as one can conceivably get to the definition of cinema in the purest sense, at least as it pertains to the marriage between image and sound. Returning cinematographer Emanuel Chivo Lubezki proves instrumental in the case of Tree of Life, using only the light immediately and naturally available to him to capture some of the most beautiful and evocative imagery ever committed to 35mm celluloid. Returning to the 1:85:1 aspect ratio for the first time since Badlands, Malick and Lubezki retained the restless, penetrating style of camera movement that marked the thin red line in the New World, constantly propelling through the frame's Z-axis. Their improvisatory style of shooting is evident throughout, using handheld or Steadicam setups that allow for the spontaneous capture of life in the present tense. Despite the relative chaos of said shooting style, the consistent use of lenses with a sprawling depth of field, or compositions that favor magic hour backlighting, allow a cohesive vision to emerge. Whole sequences are constructed entirely from these fractured snapshots and vignettes, made evocative by their implications. Lubezki would later describe this approach as meaning to trigger, quote, tons of memories, like a scent or perfume, and towards this end he and Malick are astonishingly successful, especially within the childhood scenes at the O'Brien household. Most people watching the film, at least outside of the real-life town of Smithville, Texas where these scenes were shot, cannot relate to Malick's story of growing up in suburban Waco in the 1950s, at least on a superficial level. However, Malick's enigmatic, oblique storytelling unspools like a sense memory, his fleeting images triggering flashbacks to our own childhoods as he charts Jack's response to key episodes in his psychological development. Here, the emotional milestones are not birthdays, first communions, or vacations, but rather the discovery of disease and sickness in an otherwise beautiful world, the confused shame of emerging sexuality, or the mortal terror of a father's wrath. The other narrative strands forego the earthiness and rambunctious energy of the boyhood sequences in favor of ethereal, dreamlike images that speak to the Tree of Life's profound, secular spirituality. In a film full of intensely memorable imagery, these moments stand out. A child swimming out of a bedroom submerged entirely in water, Chastain's character dancing in midair, or laying asleep in a glass coffin in the forest not unlike Sleeping Beauty. Compositions continually land on images of figures or silhouettes aimlessly moving through space, a visual echo of the character's internal restlessness. This conceit reaches its apex during adult Jack's celestial vision of what one might consider an afterlife, where he finds the younger iterations of his family amidst a legion of souls wandering a beautifully blank landscape. In his fifth consecutive collaboration with Malick, longtime production designer Jack Fisk uses his subdued and realistic period recreations to amplify the narrative's visual symbolism, particularly in regard to the found architecture of their many locations. Passing through gates comes to symbolize birth. Climbing ladders implies ascension. The film spends a significant amount of time in Jack's childhood home, one of several charming little bungalows on a sleepy suburban street, tracking the O'Brien boys through the years as they careen around the house, filling it with laughter, love, and life. Malick uses the O'Briens' eventual move from the house as the climax of the 1950s narrative, showing us the empty husk of a house they left behind. In so doing, Malick seems to be suggesting that a space is given meaning not by its shape, but by the memories we infuse in it. The tone or energy of a building is a product of the manner in which its occupants inhabit it. In this context, the modern-day sequences with adult Jack wandering his intimidating office tower suggest humanity's alienation within these colossal structures, our cosmic insignificance laid bare for all to see. Indeed, the Tree of Life is quite interested in man's place in the universe and creation. A large chunk of the narrative diverts from its focus on Jack to depict the birth of time and space, charting the evolution of life on Earth from the planet's formation on down to the emergence of complex organisms. Malick shoots these sequences on 65mm and Imax film, giving them a majestic, staggering scale to match their subject matter. A large portion of this sequence is derived from landscape aerials shot from a helicopter, featuring a variety of stunning, primal vistas from all over the world that, when placed in just the right order, recreate the millennia-spanning story of the Earth's creation. Even more impressive are the shots depicting the cosmos, which amazingly forego computer-generated imagery in favor of practical effects. Towards this end, Malick would enlist the help of Doug Trumbull, the venerated visual effects artist behind Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, bringing him out of retirement for the first time since Ridley Scott's Blade Runner 30 years prior. Trumbull utilizes high-speed photography, fluid dynamics, and other experimental techniques to render the majesty of the infinite, throwing a variety of chemicals, paints, dyes, smoke, and liquids onto spin dishes and into water tanks to capture organic reactions that closely resemble celestial phenomena. CGI is deployed, however, during what has become one of the film's most contested scenes, a brief exchange between two dinosaurs that Malick had reportedly intended to convey the genesis of complex thought beyond predator-prey instincts. The admittedly flimsy CGI undermines an interesting effort to show how relatively sophisticated ideological concepts like mercy are just as much a product of evolution as the primal biological aspects. The Tree of Life's creation sequences would prove highly inspirational for Malick. In fact, he'd accumulate enough footage to create an additional feature, expanding his exploration of life's journey with Voyage of Time. Despite telling the same story, the three cuts of Voyage of Time differ rather wildly in their respective technical presentations. Comprised of a mix of 35mm film, 65mm IMAX film, and high-resolution digital, Voyage of Time adopts an omniscient view that, like the Tree of Life, effortlessly slides along an infinite scale. Majestic magic hour aerials and swooping underwater camera work document the evolution of life on Earth, doubling down on the Tree of Life's controversial inclusion of dinosaurs by adding even more of them in all their dodgy CGI-rendered glory. The first version of Voyage of Time, running 40 minutes and dubbed the IMAX Experience, is no doubt Malick's intended exhibition format, if not his ideal length or narrative style. Presented in the square 1:43:1 frame unique to IMAX, this first version's comparatively shorter running time forces Malick to dwell on said creation sequences almost exclusively, conscripting the Tree of Life's Brad Pitt to provide a rather straightforward voiceover for narrative context. The limitations of Imax as an exhibition format, such as shorter runtimes, demanded by the sheer size of the 70mm Imax gauge when spooled up into reels, or the limited number of dedicated Imax venues, prompted Malick to generate a second, longer cut dubbed Life's Journey, running 90 minutes and presented in the conventional 185:1 aspect ratio. This version is easily the most Malickian in tone and style. Cate Blanchett, fresh off 2 collaborations with Malick on Night O' Cups and Song to Song, delivers a lyrical, introspective narration in a hushed, prayerful tone. Far more than just an extended edition, Life's Journey expands on footage seen in the IMAX experience, with low-resolution digital video footage presented in the square 133:1 frame. Speaking to Malick's latter-day interest in the juxtaposition of various formats and visual textures, with a blown-out contrast and seared colors of cheap consumer video. These sequences paint an observational, slice-of-life portrait of modern society in all its vibrant color and decrepit squalor, subverting Malick's pristine celluloid images with chunky video resembling a home movie shot while on vacation. Another narrative vignette finds early man at his most primitive, forging a meager hunter-gatherer existence in a harsh, unwelcoming environment. Some sources claim this footage actually dates back to the late 1970s, back when Malick was developing the film in its Q incarnation. However, this sequence, which was allegedly shot on 35mm film, admittedly looks a little too pristine for its supposed age, and the roaming, restless manner in which it's shot feels too much in line with his latter-day aesthetic to have credibly followed right after Days of Heaven. While these 2 versions are the ones commonly referred to when one talks of Voyage of Time, there is yet a third version, dubbed the IMAX Experience in Ultra Widescreen. This version, reportedly Malick's preferred cut of the picture, drops the narration entirely, in favor of an impressionistic soundscape comprised only of music and sound effects. The footage was also rescanned at a staggering 11,000 lines of resolution, and recomposed into a virtually unrivaled ultra-wide frame boasting dimensions of 3.6:1. Despite receiving the widest theatrical release of the 3 variants, this version is arguably the most elusive, considering its extremely short exhibition window and the total radio silence concerning an eventual home video release. It's not unusual for a Malick film to feature multiple editors, but The Tree of Life might take the cake in terms of sheer quantity. No less than 5 editors claim credit, with newcomers like Jay Rabinowitz and Daniel Resende working alongside returning collaborators Billy Weber, Hank Corbin, and Mark Yoshikawa. Together they build upon the unique style established in The Thin Red Line in the New World, whereas these 2 prior films featured conventional dialogue scenes as part of their storytelling character. The Tree of Life minimizes the exchange of dialogue to maybe a handful of select scenes, favoring the art of suggestion by zeroing in on a scene's essential image and deploying hushed, inward-looking voiceover for emotional context.
Please, God, kill him.
Music plays an important part in this approach, bridging sequences together as a singular river of story ever flowing.
Always you were calling me.
Alexandre Desplat provides a subdued original score. Indeed, it's hard to point to any particular melody or musical theme emblematic of Desplat's work here. That said, The Tree of Life is filled with music, just not his music. Like Hans Zimmer or James Horner before him, Desplat would see his work replaced by a suite of classical and religious deep cuts from Malick's own collection. These needle drops infuse Malick's cascading river of evocative imagery with the mythic aura that encapsulates his previous work. Religious tracks like John Tavener's Funeral Canticle or Zbigniew Preiser's Lacrimosa underscore Malick's approach regarding the inherent divinity of creation, evolution, and the cycle of life. Indeed, sequences like The Birth of the Universe, or Mrs. O'Brien's inconsolable grief over the loss of her son, use these tracks to capture the same kind of reverence one would witness at church. Malick also uses Vltava, the Moldau, from Bedřich Smetana's Mavlast several times throughout The Tree of Life, most notably in a sequence that features young Jack running around with his brothers, capturing the exuberance of life at its prime. If one were to make the case that The Tree of Life is Malick's best film, he or she might point to the autobiographical nature of the film's thematic and aesthetic inclinations. While the reclusive filmmaker would never admit that the film is indeed autobiographical, the parallels between Jack's story and Malick's own upbringing in mid-century Texas are too close to deny. The film's thematic explorations conform immaculately to the shape of Malick's artistry, unified by a restless, wandering spirit that manifests itself through a constantly roaming camera, listless action within the frame, and reverential voiceovers that repeatedly invoke the familial divinity of creation via personifying idioms like mother and brother. This strain of secular spirituality, beginning with the New World and continuing on through Voyage of Time, embraces nature's maternal qualities and the delicate harmony of interconnected ecosystems. This is especially true of Blanchette's voiceover in Life's Journey, which along with the Tree of Life serves as a prime example of filmmaking as a form of prayer, invoking the hidden holiness in the chemical reactions that shape our universe, or the electric signals that light up our brains with conscious, self-reflective thought. If his previous films hadn't clued us in by now, The Tree of Life and Voyage of Time make it abundantly clear that Malick sees the divine in the fragile balance of creation. Voyage of Time features a long, wordless stretch where erupting volcanoes give rise to coal-black land masses, the slow-moving waves of orange magma stopped and cooled by a frigid ocean perfectly calibrated to oppose its burn. Together, these two opposing forces build up the Earth that supports complex life through the millennia, eventually culminating in the massive, glittering cityscapes of modern human civilization. Even these artificial, man-made structures take on a symbiotic relationship with the natural world, sickening it via pollution and decay. Malick has long used the visual contrast between industrial and agrarian landscapes to better explore the theme of innocence lost. Likening mankind's aspirations towards industrialization to Adam and Eve's casting out from the biblical Garden of Eden. As evidenced by the Tree of Life's opening with a quote from the biblical book of Job, Malick's expression of nature's divinity frequently favors the visual iconography and syntax of Judeo-Christian religions, a kind of grounding device from his own upbringing that serves as a springboard into the deeper world of spirituality. Since his return to filmmaking in 1998, Malick has increasingly explored this theme through the prism of human suffering and misery. This is where Life's Journey's digital video vignettes achieve resonance, with clips shot in Los Angeles' Skid Row standing out as a display of the ravages of man's corruption, disease, addiction, mental rot, and extreme poverty. Nevertheless, Malick still presents these people as fundamentally human, capturing their misfortune with a compassionate eye. They too are the children of creation, and their estrangement from its life-sustaining purity is a development to be lamented, and if possible, rectified. The Tree of Life takes a similar approach, structuring its plot around milestone developmental episodes to better detail young Jack's reactions to the onset of puberty, the corruption of sickness, and the realization of death's quiet permanence. Childhood's simplistic view of the world gives way to an increasingly complex understanding of its realities. The act of growing up is, in and of itself, an existential crisis. Jack's boyhood home, located in the sleepy suburbs outside a small town, comes to represent the emotional purity of adolescence. All the intricacies of life boil down to their essence, the scope of Jack's world contained entirely within the limits of his immediate neighborhood. Lush with sun-dappled trees and vibrant local wildlife, these sequences are observed through the rose-tinted glasses of nostalgia, leaning into the popular idea amongst the baby boomer generation that the 1950s were a simpler, more idyllic time. Kids were free to play in the street. People regularly went to church, and a middle-class family could live comfortably off a single source of income. To his credit, Malick knows that the 1950s were far from perfect. While he doesn't go so far as to address major socio-political flashpoints like segregation, he nevertheless chips away at the era's blissful ignorance by showing us the imperfections on its fringes. A heated domestic argument behind closed doors, children eagerly running into a toxic plume of insecticide smoke, police taking a criminal away from the scene of a crime in full view of the public. Malick contrasts the simple perfection of Jack's pastoral boyhood with the disorienting complexity of adult Jack's urban surroundings, using towering glass skyscrapers and cold, cavernous interiors that actively seek to disconnect and alienate Jack from his surroundings. Even his own home as an adult lacks the warmth, intimacy, and spatial cohesion of his childhood house. Malick hammers home this stark contrast through the recurring use of an upward-looking camera that draws visual comparisons between trees and skyscrapers alike as awe-inspiring structures reaching towards the heavens. The overall effect, conveyed by both The Tree of Life and Voyage of Time, is a constant, self-reinforcing circle of thematic unity, wherein Malick's ideological interests feed into each other to create visceral and immersive experiences that are much, much more than the sum of their parts. If the thin red line and the New World represent Malick working himself back up to speed after 20 years away from filmmaking, then the success of The Tree of Life and to a far lesser extent Voyage of Time, signifies a full self-realization of his artistic character, fueled by a burning desire to push the bounds of his aesthetic and his voice to their most extreme limits. Whereas previously he had accomplished the making of only 4 features in 30 years, Malick's perfection of a free-form approach to filmmaking had the effect of kick-starting his productivity, nearly doubling his previous output in a third of the time. Now that his radical experiments with montage and poetic cinematic expression had been validated with one of the biggest honors in the international film community, Malick was emboldened to thrust himself headlong into a new, ever more abstract phase of his career, one that would seek to redefine the very concept of cinema itself.